They thought she was just another woman in a parking lot. They thought no one would believe her over a badge. On a frostbitten evening in Halifax, Constable Wade Brennick made the worst decision of his career. He saw a black woman loading boxes into an SUV and saw a thief. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't know the woman he was about to throw against her own vehicle was Lieutenant Colonel Imani Castellan, 22 years, with the Royal Canadian Air Force. 3 deployments, a chest full of commendation she'd never once had to use against her own country. For 11 freezing minutes, a man with a badge tried to humiliate a decorated officer in front of strangers. 11 minutes later, he found out exactly who he'd put his hands on. The parking garage beneath Spring Garden Place smelled like wet concrete and exhaust. Imani had been there since 6, packing up the last of her late aunt's belongings from a storage unit 2 floors down, ferrying boxes up to her Audi one armful at a time. She wore an old grey fleece with a faded RKF crest on the chest, jeans, running shoes gone soft at the heel. Nobody glances at a woman in a parking garage wearing a fleece and carrying cardboard. That was the whole point of off-duty clothes. Nobody was supposed to look twice. She checked her watch. 7:42 p.m, 3 more boxes, and she could get home, get the heat on, maybe finally eat something. She wasn't thinking about rank or duty, or the fact that on Monday she'd be back in uniform briefing a room of majors. She was thinking about her aunt's china, wrapped in newspaper, balanced precariously on top of a box of photo albums. The cruiser rolled in slow, headlights washing over the concrete pillars before settling on her. Imani didn't think much of it. Security patrols came through that garage all the time. She kept walking toward her car. "Hold it right there." The voice carried that particular flatness of a man who'd said the same line 100 times and never once had it questioned. Imani turned. A constable was already out of the cruiser, hand resting near his belt, walking toward her with the loose, rolling gait of someone who owned the room before he'd even said a word. "Evening, officer," Imani said, setting the box down on the trunk of her own car. "Can I help you with something? That your vehicle?" "It is. You got proof of that?" Imani's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even. 22 years of briefing rooms had taught her that tone was a weapon and she wasn't going to hand him one. "My registration's in the glove box. My ID's in my bag, which is on the passenger seat. Stay where you are. Don't move toward the vehicle." "I'm not moving toward anything. I'm telling you where my identification is." The constable's name tag read W. Brennick. He was younger than he sounded, maybe 35, with the kind of build that came from a gym membership more than actual labor, and eyes that had already made up their mind about her before she'd said a single word. Behind him, a second officer hung back near the cruiser, a young Filipino-Canadian constable, the name tag reading D. Santos, watching with the careful stillness of someone counting exits. "We got a call," Brennick said. "Woman loading a vehicle that doesn't match her in this garage. Suspicious activity. Doesn't match her." Imani repeated it slowly, letting the words sit in the cold air between them. "What exactly does that mean, constable?" "It means somebody thought it was worth calling in. You want to make this easy. You'll let me see what's in those boxes. These are my latent's belongings. I have a storage unit, 2 floors down. I'm not consenting to a search of my property, and I'd like you to call dispatch and have them confirm vehicle ownership against the plate, which you're welcome to run right now." It was the wrong thing to say, even though it was the exactly correct thing to say. Imani watched something shift behind Brennick's eyes. Not doubt, but irritation, the particular irritation of a man unused to a civilian quoting procedure back at him calmly instead of flinching. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Constable, I haven't done anything that turn around." Santos took a step forward. "Wade, maybe we should just run the plate first." "See what? I got this, Danny." Brennick didn't even look at his partner. He grabbed Imani's shoulder and spun her, pressing her palms flat against the cold roof of her own Audi. The box of china teetered and one corner gave way. The sound of breaking porcelain sharp in the concrete stairwell. "That was my aunt's wedding china," Imani said, and for the first time her voice cracked, not from fear, but from a grief that had nothing to do with the man currently patting down her jacket pockets like she was a person he'd caught mid-crime. Save the sob story. He found her ID in her coat pocket before she could tell him it was there. He flipped it open, glanced at it, and didn't read past the photo. "Doesn't matter who's on this. Anyone can carry someone else's wallet. It has my face on it. People steal faces too these days." He said it like it was clever. He clipped one cuff onto her right wrist, and Imani felt the cold steel bite into skin that had spent 2 decades being saluted, not shackled. "You are making an enormous mistake," Imani said quietly. The kind of quiet that should have made any reasonable man stop and listen. "Heard that one before too." Brennick clicked the second cuff shut. "Theft of vehicle contents, obstruction. We'll sort out whose china it really was downtown." Santos lingered near the broken box, looking down at the shattered porcelain, at the careful newspaper wrapping that suggested a woman who'd handled these things like they mattered. Wade. Her registration's literally sitting right there in the box on top. I can see her name on the storage unit paperwork. Bag it as evidence. Let the desk sort it out. They walked her to the cruiser. Imani didn't fight, didn't raise her voice further, because she had spent her entire adult life understanding that composure was the only weapon a person in her position got to keep, and she intended to keep it sharp. In the back seat, hands cuffed behind her, the cold plastic seat pressing into her spine, she allowed herself exactly one slow breath before she started thinking like an officer instead of a victim. She had her military ID in that wallet too, tucked behind the driver's license. Brennick hadn't looked past the photo. He hadn't looked at all. The drive to the division took 11 minutes. Imani watched the streetlights slide past the wire mesh and thought about every junior officer she'd ever trained to slow down, to verify, to never assume the person in front of you is what they appear to be at first glance. She thought about how she would have handled this exact scenario in a briefing room, calmly by the book, and how absurd it was to be living the cautionary tale instead of teaching it. "You don't have to do it this way," she said to the cage between them. "Run my name. Lieutenant Colonel Imani Castellan. Service numbers in my wallet behind the license. One phone call to Stadacona, and this ends. Lieutenant Colonel." Brennick laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Sure you are. You'll be a 5-star general by the time we get to booking." Santos, in the passenger seat, had gone very quiet. The division smelled like burnt coffee and bleach. They walked her past a row of officers doing paperwork, past a bulletin board with a faded poster about distracted driving, to a booking counter manned by a tired-looking sergeant with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "What we got, Wade?" "Female theft of property, obstruction. Says she's a colonel." Brennick set the evidence bag with Imani's wallet on the counter, the china still wrapped in newspaper sitting in a second bag beside it, one broken plate visible through the plastic. The sergeant, his name tag read R. Dumont, looked up at Imani over his glasses. There was something different in his face than there'd been in Brennick's. Not suspicion, attention. "Name," he asked her directly. "Not Brennick. Imani Castellan, Castellan. Check the wallet, Sergeant. There's a CAF identification card behind the driver's license." Dumont pulled the wallet from the bag, slid the license aside with careful fingers, and went still. "Don't bother, Ray," Brennick said, already turning away. "Book her as Jane Doe for now. We'll sort the theatrics out in the morning. Wade." Dumont's voice had changed entirely. "This is a Canadian Armed Forces ID, Lieutenant Colonel. People fake those too." Dumont typed the service number into his terminal instead of answering him. The room went quiet around the keyboard clicks. A second passed. Then the screen flashed. Not a routine personnel file, but a flagged record, the kind that triggers an automatic notification up a chain Brennick had clearly never imagined existed. Dumont's face lost its color. "Wade," he said again, and this time his hand was already reaching for the desk phone. "You need to uncuff her right now." "What? Why are you?" "She's not just a colonel, Wade. She's attached to Joint Task Force Liaison. There's a flag on this file telling me to notify the Provost Marshal's office immediately if her name comes up anywhere in a civilian system." Dumont's voice had dropped to something close to panic. "Get the cuffs off her. Now." Brennick stood frozen, the smirk draining off his face by degrees, like a man watching a wave roll in too slowly to outrun. There's no way she's." "Take the cuffs off, Constable." Dumont was already dialing. Santos moved before Brennick did, fumbling the key out of his belt, hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs himself. Imani rubbed her wrists, the skin raw where the steel had pressed too tight for too long, and said nothing for a moment, letting the silence in the booking room do the work that shouting never could. "I want everyone in this building to understand something," she finally said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had once held a room of 200 officers silent, with nothing but tone. "I did not run. I did not resist. I told this constable exactly who I was and where my identification could be found. and he chose not to look. That choice is now his to live with. The double doors at the front of the division banged open hard enough to rattle the glass partition. 4 men and women in dark tactical jackets came through fast. The kind of fast that clears a room before anyone's finished registering what's happening. Stenciled across the chest of each jacket, CFNIS, Canadian Forces National Investigation Service. Leading them was a broad-shouldered woman with silver threading through close-cropped hair, moving like every step had already been decided 3 steps ahead. "Nobody move," she said, voice cutting clean across the bullpen. "Major Renata Okwuosa, CFNIS. I need eyes on Lieutenant Colonel Castellan immediately." "Here," Imani said simply, stepping forward. Major Okwuosa's eyes swept her once, head to foot, cataloguing the red marks on her wrists, the slight tear at the shoulder seam of her fleece. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Bruised pride and a busted set of wrists. "I'll live." Imani flexed her fingers. Constable Brennick's the one who put the cuffs on. Constable Santos attempted to intervene twice and was overruled. Okwuosa turned toward Brennick like a searchlight finding its target. "You're the arresting officer?" Brennick's hand had drifted, instinctively, toward nothing in particular, the gesture of a man with nowhere left to put his hands. "I." She matched a description. "I was responding to a call about hands on your head. Interlace your fingers." Okwuosa's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You detained, cuffed, and transported a senior officer of the Canadian Armed Forces without verifying identification she explicitly directed you to, and you damaged personal property belonging to a deceased civilian in the process. You are done talking unless it's to a lawyer." A man came barreling out from the back office at the commotion, heavy-set, moustache, the kind of staff sergeant bearing that assumes ownership of a room by default. "What in God's name is going on in my division?" "Staff Sergeant," Okwuosa said, not breaking stride toward him. "This is no longer your division's matter alone. We have a federal liaison officer unlawfully detained on your watch, and I'd very much like to know how a suspicious person's call about a woman loading boxes into her own vehicle ended in cuffs within 4 minutes of contact. There's clearly been a misunderstanding. This can be sorted out informally, but we don't need to." "There will be a formal review," Okwuosa cut in, "and you will cooperate fully, or I will have a warrant for your dispatch logs within the hour." The staff sergeant's face did the math and came up short. He said nothing further. Okwuosa turned to Santos, who was standing very still near the booking counter, looking like he might be sick. "You're the one who tried to get the plate run first." "Yes, ma'am." "Twice." Santos's voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw the storage paperwork. I saw her name on it." I told him, "Write a statement. Every word of tonight, in order, while it's fresh." Okwuosa's tone softened by exactly 1 degree. "You did the right thing trying. Make sure it's on the record." It would have ended there, with an apology and a long internal review, if Sergeant Dumont hadn't called Imani back to the desk a few minutes later, his face still pale, holding up a printed dispatch log. "Ma'am, I think you should see this." He turned the page toward her. The original call. It didn't come through our regular system. It came in on a non-standard channel, patched through a private line registered to a numbered company. We don't usually even see those calls. Imani's training kicked in instantly, the part of her brain that had spent 2 decades reading patterns in places other people saw noise. "Who placed it?" Dumont scrolled. "Anonymous tip line, but the originating number traces to an address 2 blocks from that parking garage. A logistics company. Vantage Cross Freight." Imani went still. "That name's been flagged in an open file I'm aware of through liaison work. Cross-border smuggling investigation, suspected of running cargo for an organized group out of the port." She looked up at Dumont. "Someone wanted me in cuffs tonight specifically. Not a random suspicious person call. Someone watched that garage and made sure the first officer who answered it would assume the worst about me on sight." Okwuosa, listening, stepped closer. "You think this was deliberate?" "I think a 58-year-old white woman in the same garage, wearing the same fleece, wouldn't have triggered a call at all," Imani said evenly. "And I think whoever placed that call knew exactly which officer was patrolling this beat tonight, and exactly how he'd react to a black woman near a vehicle full of boxes. That's not bad luck. That's a plan with a weak link built into it on purpose." Okwuosa's jaw set. "Pull every file Vantage Cross Freight has touched in the last 6 months. Lock this division down. Nobody accesses dispatch records. Nobody shreds a single page. It took 40 minutes of digging through archived calls and badge logs before they found it. A second number on the same patched line used 3 times in the past 2 months, always routed to the same shift, always timed to Brennick's patrol. Dumont, scrolling with shaking hands, finally looked up. "There's a name attached to one of the callback numbers," he said. "It's not Vantage Cross directly. It's a personal cell registered to," he squinted at the screen. "Staff Sergeant Holloway, internal extension. It's logged as calling out from inside this building 40 minutes before your detention started, Lieutenant Colonel." The staff sergeant who'd stormed out of his office earlier hadn't returned. Okwuosa was already moving toward the back hallway, 4 investigators falling in behind her without needing to be told. Imani followed, against every instinct, telling her to sit down and let her hands stop shaking, because 22 years of service had never once taught her how to simply wait in a room while someone else finished the job. The staff sergeant's office door was locked. Through the frosted glass, a desk lamp glowed faintly, and the unmistakable shadow of a man hunched over a shredder. "Federal investigators, open the door!" No answer but the whir of the shredder accelerating. Okwuosa nodded once, and an investigator put a shoulder into the door. It gave on the second hit, the cheap lock splintering. Inside, the staff sergeant stood with a fistful of papers half fed into the machine, his face a portrait of a man who'd run out of road. "Step away from the desk," Okwuosa said. He didn't. He kept feeding pages, faster now, like speed alone might erase what was already gone. Imani recognized the look, not defiance, but the particular panic of a man more afraid of someone outside that room than anyone standing in it. "Who are you protecting?" Imani asked quietly, stepping past Okwuosa's outstretched arm. "Because whoever it is, they just let you take this fall for them while they stay clean." The staff sergeant's hands finally stilled on the machine. "You don't understand what they do to people who talk." "I do, actually," Imani said. "I've spent 2 decades briefing officers on exactly what organizations like Vantage Cross do to people who talk. Which is why I also know what happens to people who don't, once they've stopped being useful. You're not protected. You're disposable. Right now, tonight, you have exactly one choice left that doesn't end with you in a cell next to people who'll see you as a liability the moment you walk in." It took a long, silent moment. Then his shoulders dropped, the fight leaving him all at once, and he stepped back from the shredder. What survived the machine, half a stack of unshredded pages, plus the recovered fragments, was enough. Logs of payments routed through a shell account, patrol schedules shared in advance, a name, finally, at the top of the chain, a logistics executive named Garrett Thane, who'd been quietly buying off just enough of the division to keep his cargo moving through the port without inconvenient questions, and who'd apparently decided that a black officer asking too many questions near his warehouse district was worth eliminating from the picture entirely, even temporarily, even by something as crude as a false report and a predictable bad cop. 3 nights later, a coordinated raid hit a freight yard on the eastern edge of the harbor, federal investigators and CFNIS moving in tandem with the RCMP's organized crime unit. Thane was taken into custody without incident, too confident in his lawyers to bother resisting. The staff sergeant, cooperating fully, avoided the harshest charges in exchange for testimony that would eventually take down 2 more officers on the payroll. Constable Wade Brennick was a smaller story in all of it, but no less final. Stripped of his badge within the week, charged with unlawful detention, assault, and destruction of property. His case became, briefly, the subject the local papers couldn't stop running. Santos, by contrast, was offered a formal commendation, which he tried twice to decline before being told, gently, that some things you accept whether you feel you deserve them or not. On the morning the story broke publicly, reporters caught up with Imani outside the division, microphones thrust toward her in the cold. She stood very straight, the way she'd been taught to stand at every parade she'd ever attended, and she did not raise her voice. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "This isn't a story about one bad officer having a bad night. It's a story about how easily a system can be turned into a weapon when nobody stops to verify what's standing in front of them. I gave Constable Brennick every opportunity to do his job correctly. He chose, instead, to do what was easy. There's a difference between authority and assumption, and the moment you confuse one for the other, you stop protecting anybody." She paused, glancing once toward the broken box of china, still logged somewhere in an evidence room, a piece of her aunt she'd never get back. To every young officer watching this, on either side of a badge, verify before you act, listen before you assume. The next person you decide not to believe might be the one person who could have shown you exactly who you were dealing with, if you'd only given them the chance to speak. She turned and walked back toward her car, the cold Halifax air sharp against her face. And for the first time in 11 days, it felt like she could finally breathe all the way out. What do you think, friends? Did Brennick get what he deserved, or should the consequences have gone further? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one.